So I just want to get back very briefly because we're running on the clock here. You still didn't really answer the question of how you ended up disabled, how your back was broken, your ankles were broken. Did they torture you?
I think at this, well, they didn't serve me tea and crumpets.
Right.
No, I don't know where I was. I had a bag over my head. I have no idea.
But did they with clubs? What did they do exactly?
Whatever you can imagine. Whatever you can imagine.
Welcome to Israel News Talk Radio's The Tamar Yonah Show. I'm Tamar's producer, Matt Zucker. Today, Tamar has a very special guest, Jonathan Pollard. Jonathan Pollard was born in the United States in 1954. He's a former intelligence analyst for the U.S. government. And in 1985, he was accused of being a spy when he gave Israel information that was vital to its security. Information, by the way, that the USA, as an ally to Israel, was supposed to hand over to Israel. Nevertheless, he was sentenced to life in prison for violating the Espionage Act. And there were numerous attempts by politicians, both American and Israeli, to try to have him pardoned or at least to get his sentence reduced. He was finally released in 2015. He sat for 30 years in jail. After release, he was paroled, and in 2020, Jonathan and his wife Esther made Aliyah to Israel, which means moving to Israel, and they settled in Jerusalem. Sadly, sometime later, his wife Esther passed away. Approximately a year after that, at his wife Esther's behest, he married Rivka Abraham's Donin, and they currently reside in Jerusalem. And so without further ado, Tamar Yonah and Jonathan Pollard, take it away.
Thank you, Matt. All right. Well, it's really wonderful to have you on. I've been wanting to speak with you for a while. And I think that we should just start out because not our entire audience knows who you are. And so I just want to give this brief intro also is basically that you spent 30 years in prison. You were told that you would never see the light of day again, that you would die there. And so I'd like if you can just give our listeners a summary of why you were put into prison and what happened to you in prison.
Fine. I worked actually for the Office of Naval Intelligence, and my area of responsibility was the Middle East. Pretty broad area. And during my work, I was the naval officer responsible for the intelligence exchange, the American side of the naval exchange with Israel. And it soon became very apparent to me that we were stabbing Israel in the back by not abiding by the terms of the agreement. The Israelis were forthcoming in giving us information, but we were not forthcoming in returning the obligation to provide them with information. And when I asked my superiors what was going on, because I was acting under orders, I found out something very distressing, which was shortly after Israel's destruction of the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Tuwaitha, Caspar Weinberger, who was the Secretary of Defense, and Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, who went from the National Security Agency to become the deputy CIA director, they decided to institute an undeclared intelligence embargo against Israel. And it was actually pretty devastating. The problem for Israel was that they couldn't complain about this without leading to a certain misperception on the part of her Arab enemies, and misperception in terms of the actual strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship could have led to a war. More wars in the Middle East, in fact, have been precipitated by misperception than they have been by calculation. So Israel was in a very awkward position, suffering terribly from this unknown or undeclared intelligence embargo without having any way of actually dealing with it. I was not recruited. I was a walk-in.
What does that mean?
What it means is, there's some spies that are actually targeted and they're recruited either with money or other things. ideology, even an appeal to ideology. And there are other agents that, again, for a host of reasons, volunteer themselves or offer themselves to a foreign intelligence agency as an agent in place, a walk-in, they're called. With me, I didn't know what to do about the situation. I went through a lot of different drills trying to figure out how I could legally circumvent this undeclared intelligence embargo without compromising its existence. And at the end of the day, I couldn't. There just wasn't any fail-safe way of bringing this situation to the attention of people who might have been able to remedy it. So I made myself available. And it was a very traumatic event for me because I became a criminal. It didn't matter what my motives were. I broke the law. And taking it from the Israeli side, a lot of people don't understand to this day. There are two important things, I think, in this case. One, a lot of people don't understand why the Israeli government at the time, which was a national unity government, why they did this. Everybody in the cabinet knew about the operation. Let's get that out of the way right now. So why did these people, who were all very intelligent, patriotic, and why did they authorize such a type of operation? To cost benefit. What was the benefit? What was the potential cost? It's a simple proposition. And in this case, given the kind of threats we were facing at the time and the benefits of the intelligence that we were supposed to receive anyway as part of the intelligence exchange agreement, the decision was made that whatever diplomatic fallout might come as a result of my capture or exposure was compensated by the value of the information that the country was receiving. It was, from what I understand, war-winning material. Okay, that's what other people say. As far as the American side of this is concerned, I think it's important for people to understand what my indictment said and what it didn't say. I was indicted for providing classified information to a non-NATO ally, Israel, without intent to harm the United States. Why is that important? I think, there are various types of information which, if compromised to the closest of allies, could do irreparable damage to the national security. And if somebody actually did that, they should have and would have been indicted for intending to harm the United States, because the information just never should have been shared outside of approved channels. So the reason I'm making this case is that following my sentencing, there were a rash of allegations made about how damaging the case was. And it was pretty fevered, if you know what I mean, in terms of what they were alleging. It wasn't in my indictment. It wasn't in the documents. It was said in the court of public opinion. And when you tried to reason with people and say, look at my indictment, if the information that I had provided rose to that level of seriousness, I would have been indicted for having intended to harm the country, but I wasn't. The last thing is, after 20 years, I finally got a look at the real damage assessment. And what did it say? Once I read it, I understood why it took 20 years to get it. It said, for example, that Israel lost negotiating strength from me providing the information that they were supposed to get anyway, which was kind of an odd assessment. If Israel was supposed to get this information, then how did the United States lose anything in the bargaining, the quid pro quo, the back and forth? So that was one thing. The second thing that was the more interesting thing was they said that I had enraged several Middle East allies of the United States, Arab allies, who felt that I had made Israel too strong. And my response to that was alavai, which means it should be. So that's the bottom line in terms of the damage assessment. And, you know, when prosecutors lack the facts to really get a sentence they want from the court, they engage in ad hominem, character assassination, lashon hara, whatever you want to call it. And that's what happened in my case. For example, I was accused of having kind of shopped my capabilities to various countries. Well, I wasn't indicted for that, and there's a very good reason for that. Part of my job was as a liaison officer to several countries, other countries, foreign countries. And I never violated the terms and references of that exchange. So, okay, they accused me in public, but they never accused me in court of committing that kind of crime. That's an example of how this went. The other two problems I should mention, which led to the severity of my sentence, came from the fact that I was accused by Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen, the spies, the Soviet spies, one Robert Hansen in the FBI and Aldrich Ames, of course, in the CIA, for their own criminal activity on behalf of the Soviet Union. And they did that under the orders of the KGB Fifth Directorate to protect themselves. So I found out many years later that just before I was sentenced, about an hour before, Ames went into the judge, which was ex parte, by the way. Judge never should have heard it. And Ames described for him how General Trechikov, a CIA spy, was fed feet first into the furnace in the basement of the Lubyanka prison in Moscow in front of his family. And so he and Hansen blamed me for all of the then ongoing deaths of the American CIA network in Russia. There's an odd way of explaining it, that the information I provided to Israel had been compromised and wound up in Moscow. And that the Russians, very conveniently, the Soviets, exposed one of their own agents to kind of complete the circle, a low-level agent in Israel. So he said to me, this former prosecutor who was telling me this, he said, when the judge asked you if you had any remorse for all the deaths you caused, what did you say? I said, I remember saying, yes, I had remorse, that there wasn't one more. So he said, where was your head? And I said, my head was in Tunis. I was the intelligence officer that put together the raid on the PLO headquarters that was designed to kill Yasser Arafat in the wake of a terrible pigua in Larnaca, Cyprus.
Terror attack. A pigua is a terror attack.
A terror attack. It was a horrible attack against Israeli civilians in the marina. It was really, I can't even describe it publicly how bad it was. So the ex-prosecutor said to me, well, I'll tell you where the judge's mind was. His mind was in the basement of the Lubyanka. And here you are telling him that you're sorry you didn't kill one more American agent. So he said, just for the record, did you notice how many guards were in the courtroom? I said, yeah, I thought it was a little strange. He said, well, there were a lot of CIA Operations Directorate personnel that had offered to come into the court and kill you right in open court because they thought that you had been responsible for the death of so many of their agents in Russia. Well, eventually, the truth came out when Ames and Hansen were caught. And Senator Dennis D. Cassini, who was the then chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, along with a full committee of senators, wrote to President Clinton saying, you know, Pollard isn't the guy that did this, release him. And unfortunately, I had become a valuable tool at the time for certain elements in the American government to extract concessions from Israel. And I refused to have any part of that at all. I wasn't gonna play a part in that, and the Israeli government understood that. The other piece of the puzzle was the fact that I had a part to play in Iran-Contra. And when the vice president's office at the time, that's Herbert Walker Bush, found out that I knew certain things, things got very bad for me, indeed. And let's just put it this way without going into details. I'm now 100% disabled. My back is broken. I have a plate in my head. My ankles were broken. And several other things were done that I would rather not revisit. And
so this was torture? They tortured you?
Well, we call it rendition.
Meaning?
Meaning they take you, they disappear you, and they get you to do things or to say things against your will. I mean, that's the polite kind of clinical definition of rendition. In my case, what they wanted was for me to identify with a check mark a host of American Jewish leaders who I would implicate in my activities. If I had agreed to do that, I would have been responsible for decimating the American Jewish community's leadership in one go. And I was brought up in a household where it was inculcated into me that a Jew is never Mosa against another Jew, no matter who and what he is, even if they're talking against you, which many of them were at the time.
That you wouldn't give up another Jewish person. Moser.
You never do that. No, you die before you give up another Jew.
So they beat you when you didn't make those checks?
Well, if they'd beaten me, it would have been a lot easier on me than what happened. So when I finally got back to court, when my lawyers found out where I was and brought me back, the judge asked me, I was in pretty bad shape. The judge asked me, I understand that you slipped in the shower. Is that true? And I said, no, Your Honor, it's not true. I slipped twice. So, you always have to have a sense of humor about these things.
But can you be more specific? I mean, how did it happen that your back got broken, that your ankles got broken? What exactly happened?
Well, what happened was that it involved a certain ship that one of my jobs was to keep an eye out on what's called dirty ships. And these are arms carriers, merchant arms carriers that are going to terrorist groups or enemy countries. And I found one that was leaving Belgium, ostensibly for Hodeidah in Yemen, which is where the PLO headquarters was at the time before they decamped to Tunis. And so I duly reported it to the Israelis, and the ship was raided in Thessalonica, Greece, where it stopped for refueling. And lo and behold, it wasn't carrying what I thought, small arms. It was carrying a shipload of high-tech, state-of-the-art NATO equipment, and it was bound for Iran, which was hushed up at the time. So when I saw that, I realized, I stepped in something. I didn't know about that. What I didn't know was that was the first illegal arms shipment to Iran as part of the Iran-Contra scandal that had been organized and approved by none other than Herbert Walker Bush, the then vice president. This was not Ollie North. Ollie North wasn't involved yet in this operation. So when I was interrogated, and the vice president's counsel, I was surprised to see them in the room, asked me what I knew about this ship. I thought they meant the characteristics of the ship: length, width, breadth, depth, things like that. So I said, I know everything about the ship. Well, what I just told the vice president through his lawyers was, I've got information that can cost you the next presidency. So I had to be shut up very quickly. But they wanted something from me before, I guess they did away with me. And what they wanted was me to implicate these leaders of the American Jewish community in Israeli espionage. And as I said, I refused to do that. So I actually had a bagatz, a Supreme Court hearing here on what happened to me. And what I later found out was that there were people here who knew very well what was happening to me. And they not only did nothing to stop it, they gave their okay to what happened to me. There was an internal fight between Rafi Eitan's Lakam organization that I worked for and the Mossad. And it's sad for me to report this, but the Mossad did everything they humanly could to make sure that I didn't walk out of prison alive.
And was this because they wanted that their relations with the United States was more important than Jonathan Pollard?
That was
you were
one
the
reason.
Sacrificial lamb? Mm-hmm.
Right. That was one reason. The other reason was there was a real personality and organizational clash between the Mossad and Lakam. Lakam was, and it still is, actually part of the Ministry of Defense, the Kirya. And under Rafi Eitan, and with me, he was kind of showing the Mossad up as being totally inadequate as far as somehow getting around this intelligence embargo. And unfortunately, he used the information I provided during cabinet meetings to embarrass the Mossad. He was bragging about his agent. Well, you don't do that. It endangers the agent, and it just creates what we call a mochlechet, a fight between bureaucracies. Doesn't help anybody. The other thing I found out during my imprisonment was how I got caught, which a lot of people haven't been able to figure out. My lawyers sent to me a case that was occurring in a New York federal courtroom of an Israeli, a Russian Oleh, who was a very good immigrant, who was a very good friend of Ariel Sharon, who was on the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. And lo and behold, he was a CIA spy, which kind of calls into question the pot calling the kettle black. They were spying on us also. So why was he in a New York court? Well, he had retired and he was suing the CIA for an inadequate retirement. And one of the things that he listed as his accomplishments was my capture. And the judge, in his response to his complaint, said, "I've checked your allegations out. They're correct, but I think this should be done behind closed doors." Well, he didn't get the compensation he wanted. So he came back to Israel and he went on radio and he described exactly what he did to me. So Esther, may she rest in peace, immediately went to the head of the Shabak at the time and said, "Arrest the guy, trade him for my husband." And the answer was, "Geveret, Mrs. Pollard, we don't do those things. It's the Americans. We can't do that. We can't anger them." And so I rotted for it was about 10 years because of this fear of offending the Americans.
Which still exists, by the way.
It's more than exists. It completely permeates the government, the executive government, and the policy-making organs of the government, to such an extent, and I've said this publicly in speeches, we did not endure the hardships of 2,000 years of exile, of galut, in order to once again put ourselves under the thumb of an empire, a foreign empire. Look, we all know countries have permanent interests. They don't have permanent alliances.
Yeah.
And as far as our experience with the Americans are concerned, it proves the point. And if anybody has any question about that, then go to Mount Herzl, Har Herzl, to the military cemetery, and look at the 2,000 plus soldiers that died because of American perfidy when they knew a war was coming, and not only refused to tell us, but when we did find out, they deterred us from striking first. This is not an ally.
I have two questions.
We have one ally, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's it, God.
We're a nation that dwells alone. So I just want to get back very briefly because we're running on the clock here. You still didn't really answer the question of how you ended up disabled, how your back was broken, your ankles were broken. Did they torture you?
I think at this, well, they didn't serve me tea and crumpets.
Right.
No, I don't know where I was. I had a bag over my head. I have no idea.
But did they with clubs? What did they do exactly?
Whatever you can imagine. Whatever you can imagine. I really, it's difficult for me to go into the details of this, but the American prison system did come to me when it became known what happened. And they asked me, the internal security people asked me if I knew who had done it to me. And I said, no, because I had a bag over my head, but I did see the boots, and they were army boots, or actually naval boots. And so they said, well, were they prison officials? And I said, no. And that's really all they wanted to know. And one of the guys turned around and said to me, if you did know who they are, would you tell us their names? And I said, no, I'm still in prison. I can be killed at any moment under any set of circumstances right now where I am. And they understood that and they agreed to it. And they wanted to just make sure that it wasn't the Bureau of Prisons that was responsible for what happened to me.
Okay. And
but I just think the bottom line on this is that my own country knew what was going on. Israel knew what was going on, and not only did nothing to stop it, but they actually encouraged it.
I want to ask you, do you believe that the reason that the United States did not hand over this information to their ally, Israel, was because of anti-Semitism?
Yes, I mean, it played a large role in it. Look, one of the objectives of handling my case the way it was not only to intimidate both the American Jewish leadership and the American Jewish community, but also to have Israel redefined as something less than an ally. Those were the twin objectives of my prosecution. And so when you say anti-Semitism, yes, and actually towards the end of my sentence, even Abe Foxman, who was the then head of the Anti-Defamation League, came to the conclusion that, yes, anti-Semitism played a very large role in how I was handled. Look, it was reported at the time in the Jewish media that the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, no less a person than the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, justified my sentence on the basis of its intention or the intent of the government to intimidate the American Jewish community. He said it openly. I mean, I can't make this stuff up, and I certainly wouldn't make anything up unless I could prove it. Even Caspar Weinberger, the then Secretary of Defense, my nemesis, admitted to Edward Black, the noted Jewish American historian, when his memoirs came out shortly before his death. Ed did an interview for the New York Times for him and asked him, why wasn't Jonathan Pollard mentioned in your memoirs? And his answer, this is in the New York Times, his answer was, well, the Pollard case was a minor matter, made more important for other reasons. And Ed couldn't get him to say anything more than that. So there's more than enough information out there to point people in the right direction in terms of trying to figure out what the motives of the government were at the time. The one thing they were absolutely infuriated at was that this undeclared intelligence embargo had been neutralized, and that Israel had the ability, the independent ability, to defend its national interests. And that was something that many in the government at the time, particularly in the military and intelligence communities in Washington, didn't want to see happen. One response, I think, should give you some understanding or appreciation of what that meant. When I asked, why can't we give this piece of information to the Israelis as per the agreement, the answer was, let them lose a few airplanes and they'll figure it out. Well, this is blood
Say
of
no
my
more.
blood, Yeah, it couldn't. I can't say I was shocked as much as I was just really nauseated by the anti-Semitic attitude I found across the board.
Well, I think that Kissinger also told Nixon, let them bleed. He wanted Israel to bleed before, he would let Nixon send over some arms.
Them.
Yeah,
correct. And this is all on the record.
Mm-hmm.
This is all on the record. Yes, let them bleed, so that they would become more pliable in post-war negotiations.
Right.
So again, this is public information.
When you were in prison, were you kept all the time in solitary confinement?
No, the first 7 years I was kept in solitary confinement underground. And it was pretty restrictive. It was a 2 meter by 2 meter by 2 meter cell. And I don't know what we were fed, but what I was told was, you can get out of here if you talk. So I couldn't talk. So I didn't know what to do at that point. The only other alternative was to commit suicide. I mean, you have to be realistic about this. And as you know, as I joke, Jews don't commit suicide. They buy retail. So, yeah, I know. Well, that's prison humor.
What did you do all day in your cell? Did you have anything to do?
No. What I did was I divided the day up by the meals. And I exercised for one period. There were 3 periods. So I exercised during one period, quite a bit, as much as I could. And for the other 2 periods, I worked on projects in my head that I am now realizing in some startups that I have now in Israel. So that's what I did for 7 years. When I went in or down into this bore, the warden at the time looked at me and said, look around. You see everything, the sky, the grass, the air. When you come back up, you'll be a dead man in a bag. And I just said, God runs the world, not you. Well, 7 years later, it gave me great pleasure to tell him, when he was standing there when I came up, you see, God runs the world. I didn't appreciate his fist in my face, but it was the sweetest pain I ever had. I really made the guy mad.
So he socked you. He actually punched you when you said that.
I have a tooth missing because of that. Yeah.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. It's okay.
Yeah. Let's move on, if we can, to politics and current events in Israel. You after you were paroled and you were able to finally come and make Aliyah, move to Israel with your wife Esther. My impression was that you were keeping a bit of a low profile because everybody was falling on top of you, wanting to get at you and get some of you. And
the major reason was Esther was on her way out. She was dying.
Sick, yeah.
And almost all of my time was devoted to taking care of her and to trying to prolong her life as well as I could. So I just wasn't up to talking. I wasn't up to giving speeches. I wasn't up to anything except taking care of her. And so that's why. She did tell me 2 things just before she died. And she died hard. It's a brave girl. I've never known anybody as brave as she was.
What exactly did she die from?
2 forms of metastatic breast cancer leukemia, a bone marrow disease,
Wow.
and a systemic infection, a bacterial infection. Yes, she had Omicron, but it was asymptomatic. And the doctors did not want her being put in the COVID ward. They said it was inappropriate. She wasn't going to live that long anyway. But this damn government, with its obsession with COVID regulations, put this woman who was dying anyway in hell. And that's what the COVID ward was that I saw. I was the only one that was allowed in. I wore an Army biological warfare. I didn't wear a paper gown or
I lost you.
Yes.
There we go.
Okay, here we go. A paper gown. And when she said to me, "Take off your mask." So I didn't have anything to live for at that time. So she was dying, and darkness was falling on my life as well as a result. So I took my mask off in hell. And the last two things she said to me was, "Marry her," which was her friend, Rivka.
Your present wife.
My present wife. And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "I'm not going to make it. And I want you to be happy."
Wow.
The second thing she said was, and you figure out she's got minutes to live. And this is what she said to me. She said, "You know that when I die, they're coming for you. And those are the politicians," because she was the gatekeeper. She kept them all away from me while I could do my business work. And she said, "So let me ask you, what is politics?" And I looked at her and I said, "Sweetheart, you're not going to live long enough for me to give you the full academic definition." So she laughed. She said, "Politics is the art of compromise. What are you willing to compromise? Har HaBayit, the Machpelah, Hebron, all these places, Kashrut, Shabbat, what are you willing to compromise?" And I said, "Nothing. I will not compromise anything having to do with our claim to the land and our heritage here, nothing." So she said, "Remember that. Remember that. Try to stay as independent as you can. Give advice to anybody who you deem appropriate, but just be very careful, because the politicians in this country are worse than our enemies." That was the last thing she said to me before she went out. The politicians are worse than our enemies. You have to think about that for a second, because she spoke emet. She spoke the truth. And I didn't realize how bad things were until I came home. And I suddenly realized that the country that I thought I had sacrificed myself for didn't exist. It was a dream. And I guess in retrospect, if you sacrifice yourself for a good dream, it's valid. But nonetheless, what I found here was a nightmare, a real unadulterated nightmare. And we're living it out now with everything that's happening to us. They don't seem to understand. The politicians don't seem to understand that they work for us. We don't work for them. They work for us. And they don't seem to understand that. And in fact, I don't even know who they work for. It could be, I don't know, a multinational. It could be the United States. It could be a European power. I don't know. But I know for one thing, it isn't for the safety and security of this country. And I damn the entire Knesset because of that, because each and every one of them just wants their seat. That's all. They just want their seat. They don't understand that their constituents are the land and people of Israel. That's their only constituents. They work for us, and they don't understand that at all. And that's why we're in the mess we are here right now. They have no yirat shamayim. They have no fear of heaven. Yeah. And when you're dealing with somebody who doesn't have fear of heaven, and I'm talking about somebody from the Rosh HaMemshalah all the way down, when they have no fear of heaven, they are capable of anything, because they're not afraid of retribution, after our, Ad Mei Ve'Asrim, when they go before the Kisei HaKavod. You don't trust people like that.
Right.
You don't believe in God, I don't want anything to do with you. I don't trust you. You cheat
You know,
on your wife, you betray your people, you sell the country out to the highest bidder. You're capable of anything. You have no fear of heaven.
They say that in the Messianic era that there's going to be a lot of corruption in the world. And we see that with leadership, politicians, governments around the world, especially after this whole plandemic, scamdemic with the COVID, etc.
Well, what I tell people when they say we need Moshiach, it's just kind of funny. When they tell me this, I said, "What, you're waiting for Moshiach?" And they said, "Yes, to solve all these problems."
Yeah, we have
and
to
so
bring.
I said to them, "Well, maybe Moshiach is waiting for you.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever thought about that?" And they don't want to talk to me after that.
Because that puts responsibility.
No, because what that means is, and it's kind of like the emperor's new clothes, you have to say what we're doing on the Lebanese border is a joke and will bring on a war and not deter it. What we're doing in the territories is absolutely insane. What we're doing with these strikes, or not doing with the strikes, is even worse. And here's the real killer: putting masks on your children in school during the COVID epidemic, which we all knew at the time was useless. And now we're finding out the government knew it was not only useless,
right,
but it was damaging to the children.
Right.
So if you look at all of this, you have to say, what can we do to accelerate the Geula Shlema, the coming of the Moshiach? And what it means, for example, with the scamdemic, use the brain God gave you. There was enough information on the web, which was amazing because we never had this before, to show that the government was lying. We had the information. It's just that people were so sheep-like that they just blindly followed whatever the government and big pharma told them. So God gave us a brain. We should use it. I knew from the minute I was in New York at the time on parole with Esther, alayhi shalom. And when this whole COVID thing broke, I was skeptical. I come from a medical family. My father was deeply involved in biological warfare. So I kind of knew that there was a lot of misdirection in this stuff. And okay, we went through the whole hand sanitation and the masks and the insanity that they made us go through. And then one day I saw they were allowing demonstrations by leftists in New York, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, 100,000 or more people, no social distancing, no masks, no vaccination. And I said to myself, okay, I got it.
And the southern border, letting all these people come in through America's southern border that were undocumented, didn't have the COVID shot, etc.
Exactly. They wouldn't allow 10 Jewish men in Borough Park, with spacing, social spacing, with masks, with that poison, that COVID vaccine that they came up with, the mRNA vaccine. They wouldn't allow that, but they would allow hundreds of thousands of untreated immigrants, economic immigrants, not refugees, economic immigrants, pouring across the border with every type of disease you could imagine. That was okay. But God forbid, 10 Jewish men with social distancing and masks and vaccines. That was a danger to public health. Please.
And the scary thing is that they see that they got away with it. They totally controlled the people. Okay. And the people went for it, hook, line, and sinker.
You have the whole point right there. You got it. What we saw during COVID was perhaps the greatest grab for power that the establishment has made short of wartime conditions. Mm-hmm. And everybody just went along with it. So I used to tell my Jewish friends in New York, don't condemn the Germans during the Second World War for acting like a bunch of bloody sheep when they were told what to do. you're doing the same thing. You're being told to endanger the life of your children without questioning the government's right to do so. You're just going along with it. What happened here in Israel, of all places, and I've said this publicly, so I'll repeat it. Our government sold our people to the highest bidder. And I know from my own family experience that if you're going to have a trial, which is what this was, it was a global trial with none of the safeguards that a trial usually has. There was no informed consent. There was a lie that the drug had been fully approved by the FDA and the CDC in Washington. It still hasn't been.
Only for emergency use. There's a famous meme that says, if you allow the government to break the law in times of emergencies, they will create emergencies to break the law.
No, and I know from my previous work in the intelligence community that it happens more often than not. Okay, I'm a very skeptical person by nature, especially when it comes to the government. And now, after the fact, all the information is coming out. Why is it that they classified the adverse effects of this vaccine here in Israel? Why was it classified? Why don't they let people know about this? Why don't they admit that the number of COVID patients went up proportionally to all the other patients that had, influenza or other diseases? They were two divergent graphs, one for one. I mean, they're misdiagnosing. Why was it that they're paying, in the United States at least, hospitals for a diagnosis of COVID? The guy comes in, his head is on one side of the gurney, arms and legs, he got run over by a bus. They tested him for COVID, $13,000.
And they said that he died of COVID instead of...
He died of COVID. Right. he got run over by a bus. It was all
corrupt.
The whole thing was corrupt from top to bottom.
Yeah.
And people consider themselves so smart that they led themselves into the gas chambers. I mean, that was the equivalent. That's what they did. They led themselves. The government didn't even have to do anything. They just opened the door and said,
the government did do. They locked us. They isolated us. They locked us in our homes. They had the media every single day keep drumming into us. How many people got corona? How many people died from corona? This constantly.
One funny thing, that when we came back, and I was not vaccinated and Esther was not vaccinated, and we did quite well, thank you very much. When I walked into the house, Esther turned around and said, "We're in bidud." That means
isolation.
We're in isolation. And I looked at the windows of our apartment and they're all barred. We're on a ground floor. And I said, well, gee, this looks awful familiar. I'm locked down and there are bars on the window. So I said, I'm fine. There's no problem at all.
You're at home. In a very black joke.
The thing was, when Esther came here, she had zero immunity. So when we walked in to the offices of some of her doctors, they were all masked up. So I asked them, are you vaccinated? Yes. Why are you masked up? You're not going to contract anything. And they said, no, shh. We're spreaders. Being vaccinated meant that you could actually pass it on. That's why I wasn't vaccinated, because I could have, God forbid, given it to my wife. So we lived between the raindrops. That's the metaphor that I use. People were horrified when they found out that we weren't vaccinated. We were shunned. They couldn't believe that we would be so selfish as to endanger everybody around us.
Yeah, I remember.
I was asked to leave a Beit Knesset, a synagogue. Why? Because God would not speak to me. Whoa. I said, God has a lot of reasons not to speak to me, but this isn't one of them. I'm trying to protect his flock.
we're still running on the clock, and I have a lot of things I want to ask you. So maybe we can do this like bullet points, 1, 2, 3.
Fine.
Okay. So there are current events going on. You are not going into any political parties. You want to stay out of the Knesset, stay out of politics, but you still have very strong opinions. And may I say, perhaps some very good solutions as well that our own leadership is not coming up with, for the reason, as you said, that they lack, sadly, a fear of God. They're more afraid of the nations of the world than they are to God, and this is our detriment. But there's right now going on in Israel, the big story is, of course, the judicial reform, with the leftists going out into the streets. They're shutting down the country, shutting down the economy. Our IDF officers.
Quick answer.
Yeah.
All the protests that are happening and the effort to undermine our economy and our standing in the world, things that BDS could only dream about doing, has nothing to do with judicial reform. It has everything to do with the loss of power of the left wing here. Mm-hmm. And it is a bit racial as well. This is the left wing Ashkenazi elite that suddenly realized that us deplorables are now in the ascendancy here, us God-fearing deplorables. Sorry, Hillary Clinton, but that's how they view us, that we are incapable of understanding how a 21st century country should be run on liberal, woke, left-wing values. Excuse me, our values go back to Matan Torah, and even before that to Avraham Avinu. We don't need, the New York Times to tell us how we should raise our children. But this is not about, it's the loss, finally, of the last bastion of the left wing in this country, which is the High Court. We're basically run by what's called a juristocracy, a rule by unelected judges who have no control over what they do, and the legal advisors, they're legal advisors that run all our ministries. It isn't democracy. I've talked to these left-wing guys, and I said, do you actually understand what democracy is? Do you actually understand what representative government is? Do you understand that the Supreme Court is supposed to be reflective of the people's will, not what you consider as a left-winger an appropriate form of government? Look, I've talked to some of these pilots that are threatening to strike, and I asked them, did we have a democratic election? Did we have it? Yes. Did you guys lose? Yes. I said, then get over it. I said, would you be willing to just sign a statement saying that you would defend the land and people of Israel? Full stop. No al pi Torat Yisrael. Just the land and people of Israel. No. Oh, why? Because we will only defend a Jewish and democratic state. Well, I said, your definition of Judaism and democracy is a far cry from what mine is. And we had no basis for talking. So this is what we're putting up with. Don't think this is for democracy. Don't think that this is about judicial reform. This is an old-fashioned coup d'etat, attempted coup d'etat by a bunch of losers who can't get over the fact that their day of suppressing the rest of us deplorables, God-fearing deplorables, is coming to an end. Thank God, Baruch Hashem.
I want to read you something, and I have here Moshe Feiglin. For anyone who doesn't know, he was a former member of Knesset on the right. He stated recently that the left would be willing to burn down the country just as long as it would be them standing at the top of the ashes and proclaiming that they're in power. So very briefly, because I want to hit this bullet points, what would you do if you were the prime minister with any IDF commanders or reservists that refuse to serve? Wait a second. Or doctors now are saying that they're going to go on strike, that they won't work as well. What would be your solution?
Doctors. Right. Go ahead.
So what would be your solution? What would you do? You've got an insurrection now in the IDF. You have an insurrection with the medical field. What would you do?
As far as the medical field, again, as I said, I come from a medical family. And as far as I'm concerned, if you sacrifice your patients on the altar of your political ideology, you're not a doctor. You're no better than Mengele.
So you'd remove their license?
What I would do, you take their licenses permanently. That's it. You don't practice medicine anymore.
Okay, the IDF. What about the IDF?
The IDF, I've been quite I've offered very detailed solutions for this, and that is you actually mobilize reservists, and you make them sign a statement that you will defend the country no matter what the nature of the democratically elected government is, period, full stop. If they don't agree to sign, then they should be court-martialed, stripped of their rank, imprisoned, have their pensions taken away, and basically close the door on them, and that's it. They are subversive elements attempting what's called in German a putsch. Very interesting term, but it applies to these guys, these babies, these crybabies that say, if I don't agree with the government, then the country can go to hell. The army doctors saying, some of them, for example, we won't treat military patients. What? You won't treat a wounded soldier? You won't fly an airplane in defense of our country, your country? Then we don't need you. Goodbye. Wow. The country, under God's grace, will survive quite well without you. Get rid of them. Just get them out of the army, but I want them imprisoned. I want them broken publicly to serve as a warning. Yeah. That if you try to put your political interests ahead of your responsibility to your fellow Jews and the Third Jewish Commonwealth, this is what you get: a jail cell. And I know what those are like. You get a jail cell. You get fed 3 times a day, and you don't see your family. I know what that's like. Also, goodbye. You got your wish. You're a martyr to your cause. God bless you. Goodbye.
Israel's northern border right now with Hezbollah. I'm forgetting my words here, but making moves at us. What would you do?
All right. The issue is we either let them keep upping the ante until we fall into an unanticipated war. We experienced this already in 2006. I guess nobody learned their lessons from that. In war, you have to seize the initiative. You have to basically create the battlefield, and you have to eliminate through decisive action, hopefully preemptive action, or sometimes preventive action, the enemy. What that means in Lebanon is that we go first, and the enemy, while he gets a vote, it should be a pretty small one. We have no choice right now but to shape the battlefield according to our timetable and our methods. You never let the enemy do that. We already experienced that in 1973, and look what we got out of it. Over 2,000 dead. No more.
I'm going to play devil's advocate just for a moment, because I want you to be able to give an answer for everybody listening. The Israeli government, I imagine, is weak in the northern border because they realize that if they make an attack on southern Lebanon with the Hezbollah, that Iran is going to open up and they're going to get their players. The Hamas will attack us, the Hezbollah from the north, Hamas from the south, Iran from the east, and that it's going to be like a whole open front. That I have heard from other military experts that I've interviewed, that it says that when we go to war, we have to hit them all at the same time, because if we only focus on one border, it's going to be a catastrophe for Israel. Okay. So what do you have to say?
What you're talking about is a multi-front war.
Multi-front war, right.
Apart from 1948, we really haven't faced this kind of problem in the past. 1967, we took our time determining which front we would attack. 1973, it really was the same thing. And in all the combat in Lebanon, it was one front. So the key to a multi-front war is not to fight in a multi-front war. What fronts do we have? Iran, the territories, the mixed cities, Gaza, and Lebanon, Syria. The trick is to eliminate as many of those fronts as possible before you have to take on the major threat in Iran and Lebanon. And I've laid out various strategies and tactics where we can do that, where we can, for example, take care of mixed cities and prevent them from becoming enemy strongholds, where we impose our will on Yehuda and Shomron and Binyamin, the so-called West Bank, to eliminate that front, not the way we're doing now, which is kicking the can down the road, managing the enemy, etc. eliminating Hamas in Gaza and depopulating it and annexing Gaza. And as far as Iran is concerned, let me just leave you with this very sad realization. There is no level whatsoever of conventional bombing by the Air Force that will in any way significantly retard Iran's march towards the bomb. Our army has, and various governments over the years, the past years, have so mishandled not only Iran, but Lebanon. Look, who allowed Hezbollah to build up an arsenal of hundreds of thousands of missiles right now that can inflict on us a level of damage scarcely different from a nuclear strike? Who allowed this? An army that doesn't understand what decisive warfare is all about, and a political establishment that backs them up. Mm-hmm. We faced that situation in '67, by the way, and it was the army, the high command, that went to the government and said, we're going with you or without you. So make it so. Well, we don't have that type of general anymore in the army. So what do we do with Lebanon and what do we do with Iran? Okay, and I briefed this also. We worked really hard to build up our strategic arsenal. And I asked people, what did we spend all this money for in Dimona? What was this all about? And they said, well, it was deterrence. And I said, well, here's a news flash for you. The enemy, writ large, is not afraid of us anymore. So we have to use the weapons. And that means a 20-minute war against Iran. We have to take the whole country off the map. Period. Done. Wow. And as far as Lebanon is concerned, Lebanon is not a country. It's a battlefield, and we should treat it as such, with everything that means in terms of the manner of warfare, the type of weapons used, and what our ultimate end game is. The country doesn't exist. It's basically a battlefield. So with those ideas in mind, number one, you don't fight a multi-front war. You try to eliminate as many of the fronts as possible before you tackle the biggest problem, the biggest fronts, which are Lebanon and Iran. And in those two cases, you do whatever is necessary. You use whatever weapons are available to eliminate the threat. These are existential threats. So you use a weapon of existential nature. And again, I've been criticized for this by saying, you would be willing to sacrifice 80 million Iranians. Is that correct? And I said, well, let's see. 80 million Iranians versus 7 million Jews. Yeah, I would be willing to do that. I'm not going to turn the other cheek. I'm not going to wait for them to have the first shot at us. I'm not going to wait for them to use their nuclear arsenal to deter us from finishing off Hezbollah. Once they finish off our power stations, our hospital, our water purification centers, where they basically deindustrialize us, and then they sit back and say, what are you going to do? You're going to have the Iranians nuke your cities? That's the real problem with the Iranian nuclear threat. It's not that they're going to hit us. They're going to threaten us not to retaliate against Hezbollah. And in a situation like that, when finally there's a ceasefire and everything else, good luck turning your lights on. Good luck getting water out of your tap water. Good luck bringing your wounded children, chas v'shalom, to the hospital. There won't be any hospitals left. So our politicians right now, the government, is part of the problem. Our army is part of the problem. I've said it before. I've shocked a lot of people. But the biggest threat to this country are the politicians that have no fear of God, and the soldiers, the high command, that just want to kick the can down the road. They want to manage the problem. They want to end the day and go home and take it easy. Those two situations with the army and our politicians are the greatest threat right now to the survival of this country. And until we wake up, I keep telling people, why do you keep voting for the same parties? You know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. Right. You keep voting for these parties and they lie to you. And we're in a worse situation now than we were a year ago. And it's not going to get any better. So don't take to the streets. Don't stop trains. Don't block ambulances. en route to the hospital, the next time you go to the voting booth, think with your head, not some other part of the back of your body, because that's basically what's going on right now. That's all I'm telling people. Think before you vote for somebody who's lied to you. Bibi, look, I owe him a lot, for helping to bring me home. However, it pains me to say that his betrayal of his promises to his electorate on judicial reform alone is just as bad as what Naftali Bennett did when he turned his back on 500,000 voters and entered an alliance with the scum of humanity.
Yeah.
So this is what we're dealing with.
Before we end the interview, I have to ask you this question. Someone that I know that is gaga over you, he said, please ask him this. And his question is, did Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be for a blessing, tell you when he added the Hebrew letter Hey to your name, Yonatan became Yehonatan, as we learn in the Bible also, that you had a role to play in the coming of the Mashiach ben Ephraim?
Well, as a matter of fact, I was born on Tisha B'Av.
Interesting. Wait, just stop and say that there's a thought that the Messiah is going to be born on Tisha B'Av.
Trust me, you can ask my wife. I ain't the Messiah. Okay. Okay.
Now go take out the garbage.
Taking the garbage out and washing the dishes is one of the characteristics of Mashiach, I failed.
But they did that in the Bet HaMikdash, in the Holy Temple. They had to take out the garbage. They had to wash the dishes.
And yes, I'm Levim. I'm Levite on both sides of my family.
You're a Levite.
On both sides. Abba and Ima. No, the point of the matter is there were two reasons why the Rav gave me the hay. He said at the time that I'm quoting him, the Yosef HaTzadik of the generation. Okay. Why did he do that? I asked him one day when he came to see me, why did you say this about me? And this is the story he told me. He said, you asked me, why wasn't the Lubavitcher Rebbe doing more to help you? He said, do you remember that? I said, yes. He said, well, we were friends, and I went to see him with my main advisor, Rav Zafani, Zefet Tzaddik Livracha. And I asked the Rebbe, why aren't you doing more for Jonathan? And what the Rebbe told him was, I can't, because he is finishing Yosef HaTzadik's sentence.
That's Joseph the righteous in the Bible, for anyone who doesn't understand.
Right. So I said, well, if that's the case, then I shouldn't be appealing to the American Congress or the Senate or even the Knesset. I should be doing more davening.
Right.
And Esther started going to the Kotel every day for 10 years. Every day. She never missed a day, no matter how sick she was or what the nature, what the weather was like. Every day for 10 years, because we both realized my salvation was coming from HaKodesh Baruch Hu. It wasn't coming from a Congress or a Knesset or a prime minister or a president. And we did that because the Rebbe didn't know how long the actual sentence was that Yosef HaTzadik had. It was up to Hashem. Nobody knows. So with that in mind, we had to appeal to the Eibusha to set me free. And it was a miracle that I was set free. I wasn't supposed to be released, but it was a min hashamayim. It was a miracle from heaven. But that's the background to the hay, which the Rav added to my name.
Well, Jonathan Pollard, I want to really thank you for coming on and being so direct with us. It's so good to hear words of truth and not runarounds and diplomacy and talking, two faces, just to have, it's so refreshing. And whether people will agree or disagree with what you said, it is truth. And you remind me of Rabbi Meir Kahana, Zichrono Livracha, where he said what he said and he didn't worry about political correctness.
May his blood be avenged.
Amen. That's right. Okay, we won't go into that right now, because I know you have to go. to your daughter's birthday party.
Birthday party.
Thank God. You should have only happiness, and Kol Tuv,
Amen.
all the best to you. Thank you again so much for coming on the show. And we'll speak again.
My pleasure. Amen.
Thank you.
Amen.
Hey everyone, to make sure you can get access to all of our interviews, make sure to hit the subscribe button on both our YouTube and Rumble channels. Your click makes us all stronger. Thanks.